On? Yes, excellent. Hi, so as mentioned, I'm Ricardo Mendes. I'm actually the technical director for Samsung Next in Europe, where we're doing venture investments in technology innovation. Not here to talk about the investment side of things, actually, but I'll be happy to discuss that more during the breaks or after. Now, here is what I'm actually going to talk about. And we have about 15 minutes. We'll probably run over because we have a wide palette of things to go over. We're going to be talking about creativity, technology innovation, trains, large companies, hip-hop mashups, and science fiction writers. And as we go, yeah, it's a bit of a palette. But as we go over this, I'm also going to be going into some lessons that the software industry has learned that I think are useful to the media and other creative arts as well. I'm a software engineer by training myself. But given all this stuff, let's start with one shoot at the beginning. Auguste and Louis Lumière were technologists and innovators. They invented the cinematograph, but they had a multitude of movie patents to their names, including the film perforations that survive to this day. And they were not just working on cinema. I mean, they invented color film technology and the color plate, which made color photography portable. And in 1895, they had a crazy productive year. In February, they patented the cinematograph, which they had been working on for a couple of years. In March 19, they started recording footage. By March 22nd, they were holding their first private showings. And by December, they had a paid public screening of 10 shorts. This is an iteration speed that most startups wish they could keep up. And on top of that, the traction, wow, like people hadn't ever seen anything like it. They just ate up anything the Lumières would put out. Now, in December of 1895, they put out the Arrival of a Train at Le Chotat station, actually January of 1896. And I'm going to give you a minute to appreciate this. Now, the stories go that the projection was so realistic that people freaked out at the arrival of a train and ran out of the theater. And whether these are true or not is in dispute. This might just be apocryphal, but I'm sure that the Lumières benefited from stories that their projection was so realistic that people were getting scared about it. Because make no mistakes, the Lumières understood not only technology, but marketing. Actually, earlier in 1895, they had a hand on creating the world's first film poster. So they understood marketing, they understood technology, they invented an entire genre, and then they abandoned it. Just a few years later, they declared that cinema is an invention without any future because their audience were dwindling massively. And their audience were dwindling massively because they got tired of just looking at moving pictures. They were obviously, hilariously wrong, right? We wouldn't be here otherwise. But they were so convinced of this that they even refused to license their inventions to others. And this leads us to the first issue that I want to discuss today, which is that when we think about innovation, we think that innovation is something that you know that what you're doing, you know where you're going for. But I believe that if you're truly innovating, you have no idea what you're doing. And I mean this in a good way, I swear. I think it's something you should embrace. And I know that given that we work with technology innovators, putting it this way might get me in trouble, but you have to think that if you're truly innovating, you're creating something for which there actually is no parallel out there. You have no idea what the potential of this thing is, and you have no idea what you or others are going to do with it. As William Gibson, science fiction writer, said, the street finds its uses for things. That's why it's really rare to find an innovator who can actually figure right away the implications of what they're creating. Because what's important is not the gadget. What's important is what you end up doing with it. And hold that thought for a moment, because we're going to get back to this quickly. Because I want to talk about creativity. Now, what the Lumières conceived with the cinematograph, they thought that it didn't have a future just because people got bored of looking at moving pictures. And this happened because the short were one-trick ponies. Now, unfortunately for them, they couldn't conceive a use beyond the one that they themselves were giving to the cinematograph. And it might be funny to describe the arrival of a train as realistic nowadays, because when we look at it, it's missing some obvious things that we would expect. I mean, maybe the most immediate one is sound, but that was merely a technical constraint. It's also missing some things that would have been possible with the technology of the time. It's missing, for instance, a narration. It's missing editing. And these are all things that they could have done. Contrast instead with George Albert Smith's A Scene Through a Telescope. It came out just a few years later in the early 1900s, actually, in the early 1900s specifically. And here we see some of the things that we could expect. Sure, it starts with a static camera, with a static shot like the Lumieres do, like the Lumiere shots do, but then we get this, eventually. And this is two things that didn't exist before. First, this is a cut to a different scene. And second, it's a close-up. This is a different perspective from what we had before. And he's spending so long on it that it would make you think that he had the same thing about feet that Quentin Tarantino did, but let's give him a little bit. And eventually, there we go, eventually we go back and we see that what we were looking at was the character's perspective. So there's like 3-4 things that nobody had done before, all in the space of less of a minute here. And at the very end, we see that this was all set up for a bit of slapstick comedy on top of everything else. Now, arrival of a train is what in software terms we would call a technical demo, effectively. It didn't really do anything with the technology. All it did was showcase its capabilities. But it was a direct one-to-one replacement of what had come before. Before you had static pictures, now you have moving pictures, which is where we get movies from. On the other hand, A Scene Through a Telescope is an application of technology to create something new. You could have done slapstick on a theater, obviously. I mean, theater and burlesque, opera were rife with it. But you couldn't have done this. You couldn't have cut through a different perspective. You couldn't have shown us exactly what a character was seeing, literally as seen through a telescope. And this application of technology to create something, to create a narrative form that just couldn't have existed before, this is what I'm really interested in. And therein lies the lesson that the software industry has learned, where there's cemeteries full of startups which invented technology but didn't really capitalize on it. Innovation is about making something new. Creativity is about how you use this new thing that you have created. And if innovation isn't careful, creativity can eat it for breakfast. And this is important because I think that all too often we over-index on technology innovation and don't pay as much attention to the creative side of things. And I've been guilty of this myself. Just a few months ago, we were at the Transylvanian Film Festival speaking at the Infinitive Summit, and after all the talks, the organizer asked every speaker the same question. What happens when film meets tech? And, I stood there, heard some of the answers, like, hey, better distribution mechanisms, ease of payment, reduce piracy, new narrative forms. I had suggested a few of those myself on the talk, but as I heard the answers, finally the penny dropped, and I realized there was something that we were all ignoring, which is that film is a technology. Film is just a technology that we're already used to, and because we're used to, it's commonplace, it's plumbing. And one only thinks about plumbing when it fails. I mean, we're so used to film that unless you're this guy, you probably don't even bother with film anymore. It's so digital now, but we still call it film because it's something that we're used to, and it's a direct one-to-one replacement. One-to-one replacements are something we like because they're easy to reason about. But I would argue that is not where the potential, where the interesting potential actually lies. Now, let me jump forward here a few years. Once upon a time, Microsoft was a tiny company. They made software for PCs, which were an insignificant percentage of the market and were expensive and definitely not commoditized. Now, Microsoft got huge. And it wasn't really technology innovation that made them. Because for a good couple decades there, Microsoft were followers, not leaders, even though they have improved massively since. And there's a lot we could say about their savage business practices during the 80s and 90s, but this only helped. This was also not what made Microsoft what it is now. What made Microsoft was a key realization of the founders of the company, which was that they realized that it didn't matter what you could get from the current market share, from the current install base. What mattered was what percentage of new users and machines you could get. Now, Microsoft could just have decided to only build software for the extremely large mainframe market and decided that PCs would never amount to much. But if they had decided that, I doubt that they would have amounted to much themselves. Now, why is this important? Because I meet a lot of people who are working in film who think of their audiences as a direct one-to-one replacement of moviegoers. And get a mental image of moviegoers right now. It's a family going to a theater in a mall. Theaters, even malls, are basically just delivery mechanisms. They're a cathedral, built back when people couldn't get access to the entertainment gospel anywhere else. The few people who got lucky enough to preach at these cathedrals, they knew who their audiences were. They knew where they're coming from. They knew what to give them. This is obviously not the future. And I know what you're thinking, like, well, of course it's not, right? But neither might be Netflix. Netflix is just the now. There will be an influx of people coming in. They will come from places you don't expect and areas you would not have considered markets. You don't know these people. But I'm going to tell you something that is likely to help you when you encounter them and you have to deal with them. You need to think about them as users, not viewers. If movie theaters were cathedrals, Netflix is a television evangelist. And I think that the future is something different. I think the future is even a little bit weirder. The future is customized. The future is personal. The future is up to a point apocryphal. Because there's new people coming in, they're going to want to interact with your creations. And the thing is, not all of them are going to agree with you. Some of them are going to think that your work will be better if it was edited differently, or if it had a different soundtrack, or if it was remixed with Jay-Z. And some will do something about it. And when they do, here's another lesson that the software industry has learned. Don't fight the users. You won't win. You just alienate them. What you need to do instead is become enablers. Help create a read-write future. Because this is a form of creativity. And those of us here, those who write or film or compose or build things, we don't have a monopoly on creativity. There's an army of people out there hoping to take your creations and platform and build something with them. Maybe they wouldn't come up with your ideas in the first place. Maybe they wouldn't have laid the foundations themselves, but they can help take your work and bring it further. And it isn't until now that we have technology that can help enforce content profit sharing, for instance. You get to build into this platform, so you get to create new ones and help create a more interesting future, because there are some fundamental changes happening. And you can see this on how remixing has helped create entire new careers, like with Danger Mouse, who became known when he released the Grey album, who has heard the Grey album, actually? I'm curious. Nobody. Interesting. This was, I think, 2006. It's basically a remix of an a cappella version of Jay-Z's The Black Album with the Beatles' White Album. And it's a fascinating construct, and it actually helped introduce audiences of both artists to the other. And this can also help me make feel fresh things that felt stale even when they came out. Like when this user who goes by the name of Only Yoda Forgives took the 3 Star Wars prequels, re-edited them into a 90-minute movie, into a single 90-minute movie, and added a new soundtrack to kind of give it the same feeling as the movie Drive, in case you're familiar with it. Or it can also bring forward something weird and interesting, like when 2Melo decided to mix Jay-Z with Chrono Trigger. And he created an epic that mixes Jay-Z's lyrics with new narration and game music. And it's something completely new. And then he followed it up with a sequel that mixes NAS and Castlevania and has a continuation of the plot of the original. With this in mind, I would advise you, if you're creating something, to consider the Creative Commons. Now, I don't have enough time to go into them, but I would recommend that you watch Lawrence Lessig's sensational TED Talk, 11 Laws That Choke Creativity, which is actually about 11 years old by now. Now, if you're wondering about the effects of Creative Commons, I would recommend that you check out Blindside. It's a sensational, fantastic book, science fiction book, dense with ideas, that has become extremely influential with both scientists and science fiction authors since it came out. It was released under Creative Commons, and the thing is, chances are that if he hadn't released it under Creative Commons, I wouldn't be here talking about it, because Peter Watts himself credits releasing the book under that license with rescuing his career from obscurity. And of course, the inevitable question is, well, what if I do and they copy my stuff? Guess what? Piracy has remained at above 90% since the 1970s, at least on software. All the DRM in the world hasn't really helped. What if they copy your stuff? They're going to. Someone will. And you might as well have a say on how it happens. Because we need to enable convenience. Make sure that it's people to come to you. You know, as far as entertainment goes, we live in a post-scarcity era. There's more content out there than anyone could consume. I'm happy to pay for content myself, for instance, but if it doesn't make it difficult for me, if it doesn't take my card, if DRM stops me from playing it on the device that I want, if it doesn't have subtitles, I'm not gonna bother. I'm gonna find another avenue. And I'm one of those few people who are technology savvy and willing to give it multiple tries. And if you're still doubtful about Creative Commons, I would advise you to read what Cory Doctorow wrote. He's a very well-known science fiction author, and he releases his books under Creative Commons as well. And the way that he put it is that for any creator, obscurity is a much bigger danger than piracy. Now, Creative Commons and the remix culture are part of a larger pattern. And by examining it, we can go into the final lesson that I want to bring out today. This pattern is something that was obvious in the 19th century, when the Lumières innovated, but then myopically decided that their invention wasn't going to lead anywhere and refused to license their content to others. This lesson is something that can be transformative, as we can see in the case of Microsoft, whose one CEO called open source a cancer, and Microsoft has now transformed itself into a very profitable open source company. And it's also a lesson that's very expensive to forget. Just ask IBM, who was once an unstoppable behemoth and recently had to acquire Red Hat for $33 billion in cash, or pretty much a full third of IBM's whole net value. Here's that lesson. And if you remember nothing else about this talk, remember this. If there's one thing that the software industry has learned over and over again, is that there is always a bad idea to bet against openness. If you will allow me to stretch a bit the analogy, keep this in mind, because I think that every technology era is the arrival of a train. And we have a massive one pulling in right now, with 5G, with decentralization, with the switch to mobile, with everybody here carrying supercomputers in their pockets. I can tell you where this is going. I have no idea. But I can tell you that it's likely to be full with users and creators, people willing to take your content and bring it further, and on top of that, to pay for the privilege. Are you getting on board? Or are you staying behind at the station, hoping to capitalize on the dwindling base of you people who are just happy to be consumers? Thank you.